George Lisle, I'll let you walk him in, and then I'll tack on to that, Isaiah.
Yeah, so if you are a Christian and you took a church history course and they made you think that Adoram and Ann Judson were the first American missionaries abroad, or William Carey, they lied to you. Well, and maybe they didn't do it.
Let's just say, can we say they're wrong? Can we just say they're wrong?
Right.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Because I didn't know about George Lisle until I started studying this stuff, and I would have told someone. I want to be more charitable. I would have told someone 5 years ago, maybe I would have said Adoram Judson. I would have said another name as far as the first, like American. I would have said the same thing 5 or 6 years ago. You know what I'm saying? But go ahead.
Yeah. So let me be more charitable. I don't want to say they lied to you. They just they just maybe aren't informed about the history. This man George Lisle, just an amazing story. Of course, born into slavery in Virginia, ultimately becomes the property of a man named Henry Sharp in Georgia. Henry Sharp is a deacon of a church called the Big Buckhead Baptist Church.
Wait, hold up. Yeah. I didn't know this about him. The church is called Big Buckhead?
Yeah, Big Buckhead. I think it's Big Buckhead Creek, if I'm not
I'm
not
sorry,
mistaken.
Man. I'm sorry. I know it's a reference to, I guess, a deer, but it just sounds funny. Big Buckhead. I'm sorry, it just sounds funny.
Well, in Atlanta, the most affluent neighborhood in Atlanta is Buckhead.
I did not know that.
Yeah, man.
All right, well, I'm listening to you. Well, you're the man.
Yeah. So the pastor there at the Buckhead Baptist Church is a man by the name of Matthew Moore, and Henry Sharp, who owned George Lisle, was a deacon there at the church, and that's where George Lisle was converted. And almost immediately after he was converted, he began ministering to the other slaves, and it became apparent, it became evident that he had an unusual and unique call on his life to preach the gospel and to teach God's word. And so they licensed him, and he became the first black person licensed in America. I was going to say Black Baptist, but no, he's actually the first. No. The first Black Baptist licensed in America. And shortly after that, he begins to, minister all around the coast of Georgia and South Carolina. And he actually becomes pretty well known and pretty prominent as a preacher. And he would preach to both, free and slave, black and white. And ultimately, he ends up, like I said, at the Silver Bluff Church in South Carolina. And then from there, now you have to understand, he, like David George, was a British loyalist as well. Henry Sharp, his former owner, was a British loyalist as well. Henry Sharp ultimately sets George Lisle free because he realizes that, George can't be enslaved and, be free to preach the gospel. One of those two things had to give, so he's ultimately freed. But ultimately, as a British loyalist, George Lisle eventually goes to Savannah. Savannah was a stronghold for the crown, and the first African Baptist church was established, and he becomes the first pastor of the first African Baptist church. But as we know, the crown didn't ultimately win the Revolutionary War. And so a lot of the British loyalists, both black and white, they had to find something else to do. So George Lisle ultimately goes to Jamaica. And while he's in Jamaica, he's not just, sipping pina coladas in the sun. The dude is working hard for the gospel. He establishes numerous Baptist churches. He is actually supported financially because of the work that he does in Jamaica. He essentially brings the gospel and the Baptist faith out to Jamaica as a missionary. So, he precedes Adoram Judson. He precedes William Carey. And even in Jamaica today, George Liele is a very well-known figure and missionary. Yeah, George Liele is absolutely a beast.
So George Liele, to kind of reiterate some of what we went over with him. So he's born on a Virginia plantation and was later freed. As far, just like Isaiah mentioned, he was converted at 23 years old. And then 1 year before the War for Independence began, 1 year before America's Declaration of Independence, 1776, in 1775, he became the first black person, like you mentioned, ordained as a pastor. And then he was one of the first black traveling evangelists, maybe the first as far as that goes, which is, again, think about doing traveling evangelism in 2019. Now rewind back and think about the difficulties. You've heard of the circuit riders. Imagine doing traveling evangelism in the United States back then. And eventually in 1782, he left for Jamaica, and he was the first American missionary. This is 30 years before, I always mess up his name, but Judson. The first name sometimes messes me up. The point of saying this, everyone, is not to take away from Judson. That's not the point. God's missionaries are God's missionaries, and they go where God has them, and we laud their obedience and courage and bravery and all of that stuff. We're just saying, isn't it a beautiful, amazing thing that despite the hardships that a black person would face in America, that the first missionary out of America was actually a black person? That is astounding. That is amazing. And this is, again, 30 years before Judson. And wouldn't it be a great part of church history if that was taught, and it was intertwined in there together, and stuff like this was known? It'd be a beautiful testimony to what God has done, and I hope over time things like this do get corrected in sort of the larger mainstream Christianity, and more you hear about George Liele. And just like Judson, it's hard to say household name because how many of us evangelicals know church history, but within sort of that world, George Liele is considered a standard figure in early pioneer missions because he was. So all we're doing is recognizing it. Now, he eventually died in Jamaica, and it's estimated by many, it's difficult to track these things down, that George Liele, by the end of his life, which he died in 1820, probably baptized about 500 people personally. That's the figure I got when I studied this, and it's just absolutely amazing. And it's like, this is someone we should know about. This is a good role model for your children. You know what I'm saying? But this George Liele, do you have notes in front of you, Isaiah? Are you doing this all top of your head?
Yeah, man. Yep. You
don't have any notes in front of you?
I got my phone.
Oh man, dude, you're something else, man. I'm for real. I'm real glad you came on today. Street Apologist. Street Apologist. Street Apologist. Street Apologist.